Hermes is probably a bad name. That one's kind of been taken and used all over the place.
It's called Hermes, man.
Yeah. Full screen.
Yeah, Google it, Command plus to
Yeah, I gave my Mac to my mom a couple years ago, so my brain is having to remember how to do the backwards for you. Okay, so what were we talking about? Oh, right. So you have the basic configuration, and so you have pages, and you can do the Next.js style because eventually I would like to swap over.
Command plus, certainly.
Make this really big so you can see that.
There you go.
So eventually I would like to move the work project over to this because Next.js makes me want to stab somebody. But, so I'm making it as, the idea is to be able to move away from the things about Next.js that make me want to scream, but also in the transition period, make it as low friction as I can manage. So you have page TSX, it has an app. It has the whole use server directive thing so that the runtime knows that this is a server file. And then, you have use server? Use client, that one's use client. You have server files, which I just named .server for convenience. Use server, it knows that needs to be run on the server. You have a layout file, it has the basic HTML rendering stuff. And then, because Next.js's conventions make you want to scream, you just have configuration. What are pages? Whatever you want them to be. How does the URL of a page get converted into the URL that or how does the path of a page file translate to the URL that you can access in your browser? Whatever you want it to be. What is the layout? Whatever you want it to be. So that's the basic premise of making a thing that is kind of sort of like Next.js, where you have server-side rendering and client rendering, and I'm using React. The client side certainly doesn't have to be React. You could do something that was purely client side plus or JavaScript on the client, whatever you felt like using, whatever framework, plus a Go API. But that's not what I wanted to do. For compatibility, to hopefully be able to migrate stuff, it is built with the intent of using React on the server. So the Go part, there's a fair amount of stuff. I wrote my own blog parsing library because the ones that existed were annoying me and had weird bugs. Like if you did */ page.tsx, it would not match page.tsx at the root. It would only match page.tsx in a folder. So there's a block library that I should probably move somewhere else into its own package. Most of the logic is in here. It's a little bit complicated. I'm using ESBuild. So if you're unfamiliar with ESBuild, it is a JavaScript turn TypeScript, TSX, JSX, whatever into things that the browser can understand. And it's written in Go. It has a Go API. It also has lots of JavaScript stuff, but this is Go meetup. It has a Go API. There's a couple of different functions. So you have the basic thing. Namespace is mostly for convenience when you're looking at things in the browser, so that the browser, if you have different namespaces, different chunks of code, then the browser will put them in little different buckets when you're debugging. The ESBuild configuration, some rewrite rules to change dependencies and that kind of stuff. So there's a transform function where you say, okay, also it's using the Go file system thing. So if you're unfamiliar with the FS package, the idea is you have a read-only file system abstraction such that you could have a zip file or an actual directory on your disk or files that are embedded into your binary that present as if they're a file system, and it all goes through this abstraction. So I had to fork ESBuild to make it use file system. That pull request has not been responded to yet. So ESBuild is reading from the file system. You have a name, it converts it into JavaScript. And there's transform, there's build, which maps to ESBuild's, well, that used to say transform, but which maps to I have a file that I want to convert, or I want to bundle various different files. And there's some shenanigans here. There's a the ES Build plugin, through their plugin API, this is how the actual patching happens. So if there's a client file and there's a server file, detecting those boundaries, handling those boundaries is mediated through this system. So if you have a bunch of JavaScript files that are calling each other, back when we didn't have HTTP2, every file has to have a new TCP connection. Every HTTP request has to have a new TCP connection.
That's not true. That's not true. You can still pipeline like in HTTP1.
Okay, in the bad old days, before they did that. Anyways, so you have various different TCP connections, and you can only have a maximum of 6 simultaneous TCP connections. So there's a fair amount of bottlenecking there. So people said, hey, what if we took all of our JavaScript and smashed it into one file, aka bundle, to reduce the number of resources that a page has to load. So ES-Build does part of that bundling, and if you just say, go ES-Build my stuff, go bundle my stuff, it will turn everything into a single massive file. If you use a plugin, you can say, hey, this piece is external or this piece is not external. So Hermes says, there's some other shenanigans going on, but at the basic level, if you call something like a node package, if you're referencing a different package, then it says, okay, we're going to treat that as a different bundle. And that was just a decision I made. So if you're looking at the application when it's loading, you load the user code, and at least for the purposes of development, I have every single user file not bundled, because that makes partial updates easier. That makes things a lot faster when you're developing. When you change this file, you don't have to rebundle everything. A dependency, a node package like React, those are bundled on the package boundaries, so React is going to be a bundle. That all happens in here. It's a little bit weird to get into. Oh, and look, I forgot some debugging stuff, oops. But things like, okay, we'll do a regex and figure out which node package we're looking at and decide if it's external or not. And then there's some cases where if ES-Build says it's external, that means it's probably something that's built into Node, like the stream package. So we're just going to leave that. We're not going to attempt to bundle that. And I did some shenanigans that I'll go over in a bit. So this is the bundle, and this handles the boundaries. So this code does not itself directly handle the boundaries, but there's another layer on top of that where, is that right? Well, effectively what happens is when you have a user file, oh, I guess it's because I'm not currently bundling any of the user files. So when you have a browser file, then that browser file, you load the HTML page. The HTML page says, here's your main script, and then loads that script. ES-Build is not currently bundling the user files, so if that browser script references something that needs to be executed on the server, then the HTTP handler will say, oh, that is the thing that needs to be handled on the server. So there's the handling page routes there, but if you have some file, if you have a JavaScript file, then it's going to say, okay, I need to serve this file, and it knows, because of that use server, use client, it knows which files are servers, or which files should only be executed on the server. So I have this file system here that handles that. So I guess actually that's handling the file system. So in the file system, it's using URLs. So if you say, I want to read a server file, or, well, when you open a file with this file system abstraction piece, I have a couple of them, you say, I want to open a user file, or a browser file, or a server file, or something like that. So if you open, this is the piece that does, oh no, it's cache, right? This cache also caches things, so it doesn't retransform files when they haven't changed. So public files, browser files, we have an ES-Build configuration for those. We're targeting the browser. Because of the history of JavaScript, if you have an old school Node package, or a package that is transpiled into an old school Node module, like React is transpiled into the common JS format. Common JS modules cannot handle asynchronous dependency loading. So when React when React wants to load one of its other dependencies, that has to be a synchronous call. React says require, and when it says require, if that call returns a promise, things explode. So I have to convert everything into CJS, into the common JS instead of the native. So browsers can understand natively, they can understand new ECMA script modules.
I'm really dumb on the whole React server-side side. Like, I've never really grokked like how it's supposed to work and why I want it. How does the web server piece, like, what actually runs the server-side in this case? Are you only hitting a Go backend, or are you doing a mix of Node and Go with like a caddy?
I have a Node binary that listens on so the Go process creates an anonymous Unix socket and then passes that anonymous Unix socket as a file descriptor when it launches Node. So I hand in the file descriptor to Node, and then Node sets up an HTTP server, so I am proxying through an anonymous Unix socket, so I'm not listening to random sockets. I tried to use.
So no, you're okay. I see.
Any
So Node
server-side-
is being your actual HTTP server here. You're not using. It's not like literally CGI, but it's that kind of like a fast CGI style model as far as how it's doing this batch back.
Functionally, the main HTTP server is Go.
Yeah.
And I have a reverse proxy, a private reverse proxy to a Node process for anything that needs to happen in Node.
Oh,
So if
okay.
you didn't care about React server side, you don't have to have that. You can disable that process, it doesn't matter. And you just have a Go process. You can wrap, I intend to export this such that you can create your own binary and wrap around it. You can instantiate the HTTP listener, you can add your own API on top of it as long as you don't interfere with any of the plumbing stuff. And then you don't have to have any Node server side at all. But if you do want to use the Node server side, it has this private reverse proxy nonsense for doing the stuff that has to be done in Node. The stuff I was talking about is when you're running in the browser, whatever you're doing in the browser, if your browser code is calling a NPM package, and the authors of that NPM package have decided to deploy it as a not modern module, then that not modern module, if it depends on anything else, that link cannot be asynchronous, which means you cannot use native browser modules. So I have to convert everything to CJS, subtract the dependencies, because the loading in the browser is actually asynchronous because you're making HTTP requests. There's runtime that I track all the dependencies through the ES build process. I create an array of dependencies. I say, if you're going to load this thing, load all these things first, and then when it does the give me the dependency, that can be synchronous because it's already been loaded. So there's some wrapping to handle that runtime stuff. And then whenever you request a file, it's going to convert it into, it's going to do the translation, the ES build, bundling, all that kind of stuff. Server side, if you have server side JavaScript files, then there's a piece for that. And where is that? Oh, I can't remember where in all of this the code is right now, but essentially, if the browser sends a request for a JavaScript file, and the server says that JavaScript file needs to be executed on the server, then the server responds with a proxy that forwards all function calls through an HTTP call. So the browser gets a proxy, a JavaScript proxy. Whenever you say, I want this function from this module, then it gives you a wrapper. When that function is called, it sends an HTTP request. The Go HTTP handler says, hey, this has the special path prefix server. I'm going to send this to the Node process. The Node process executes the call, and then it returns it back. So it looks like you're calling a function, but you're actually going through the hash.
What's the wire protocol look like? Is like JSON RPC or curve or something?
Mostly JSON, unless you have a blob or a file. If you have a blob or a file, it says, your parameters have a blob or a file. If you try to turn that into JSON, that sucks. So we're going to use a multi-part view. So it will just decide, you have a big thing, I'm gonna use multi-part form because then the encoding overhead is a lot less obnoxious. But that's handled internally. So yeah, I have the various different chunks. This files, I think the files is primarily, this is kind of the base level abstraction. So when you're loading something, it's a URL like user public : // path or user server : / path. So it knows where to load it from. Because there's different file systems, and one of the ideas of this is you could bundle everything into a single Go library. Hermes could have a command that takes all of your files and generates a new Go file that has a embed directive that takes all of your user files, embeds those into the binary, and then when it's serving from the embedded files, and you can deploy your application as a single binary without having to deploy all your user files to it.
Yeah, you're not worried about permissions or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just already there.
Stuck in a binary.
The node server side is something here, right? You still have an actual node.
So what the node server side does, because I wanted to write all that in TypeScript, when you boot up, transpile, so I guess, okay. The way it works today is you have a FS for the client files. Well, you have an FS that, I guess you really only have one FS. I had like separate the runtime files and the user files. That turned out to be a huge mess. So now I have a node package that you import. So all of the runtime files are just another node module dependency of your project. So you have a file system, and then there's this abstraction on top of it that will read those directives, those use server, use client directives to kind of create this artificial split. And then it will, for the server side stuff, for the node server process, it will use ESBuild and transpile that and write that to a cache folder. And it will do the same thing, all the files get transpiled and written to a cache folder. And they get executed or served out of the cache folder. And that's what gets passed to the node runtime. So you could package the files and then it has to build the cache on disk, or you could pre-compile everything, put that in the file system, and then you would need to write that out to disk from node. Though actually you can pass just a string directly to node. Probably saner to write it out to disk first though. So there's a file system abstraction to keep those parts separate. Got a stat function. I tacked is this supposed to run on the server or the user into the stat function. It has a directive for the thing at the top of the file. It's got a cache, a sync map to try to be more efficient about it. And then on top of this abstraction, there's code for get directive, open the thing. And some of this is legacy stuff for when I had the code split up into 2 different folders. And read string, read the first line, trim stuff, just basic processing. So the cache handles the transpilation. So in the namespace of user public files, we do some stuff. In the namespace of user server files, we do some stuff. Slightly different parameters. We're targeting node instead of targeting the browser. We're using this React server condition, which changes how ESBuild loads different things. In your NPM package, you can say, if browser, load this file. If node, load this file. And React server, for some reason, is a different environment that isn't node because whatever. That's what they did. And there's some stuff here like, okay, well, we're going to bundle if it's a node module and not bundle otherwise. Templates to wrap things so it can handle change the way that the dependencies are resolved. Since there's this weird disconnect between you have a virtual file system, and so your paths don't represent actual paths on disk, and then I'm writing to a cache, and then things in the cache are referencing other things in the cache, but the paths that it knows about during build time are paths that are in the context of this file system abstraction, but then on the disk you actually have this prefix that is wherever the heck your cache is. So I patched I put a wrapper around those things to patch the require process. And then there's some stuff, if you have a server component that's calling a client component, you have to do some shenanigans there. And this is the actual rendering process. So this is a little bit weird because if you have a client, when you're serving code to the client, if that code depends on other code, then you serve a file that says, hey, I need these other things. And then the runtime goes, cool, you need those other things. With Node, it expects everything to be on disk. So with Node, when it's compiling a server-side JavaScript, or when Hermes is compiling a server-side JavaScript file, then it eagerly says, oh, you have this dependency, that dependency, I'm gonna go recursively build all those things. Recursively process all the dependencies, because ESBuild conveniently, well, ESBuild says, hey, this thing is importing that thing, what do you want to do about it? So I can just shove that metadata in a map and track the dependencies. This, just opening it, right, so this is the cache that handles the conversion, so you can serve things in the browser and or Node. So if it's not one of those files, then it doesn't do anything. You know, if it's a CSS file, don't need to mess with that. Could theoretically, but don't need to. This is, previously there was user browser, user server, runtime browser, runtime server, or browser/client. But that's kind of legacy stuff. So talking about that, ESBuilds, just some helper functions. This is just configuration mainly, set up various different things. The actual HTTP server. So this is the main entry point. You know, Hermes is an HTTP server. So if you have a page route, then you have some JavaScript file that is the page that you want to serve. And when you boot up, it will scan your directory for anything that matches that glob. And it will create a cache of, here's a thing that matches the glob, this is the path that you should use that to respond to. So with the configuration, page.tsx at the root responds to /log/page.tsx would respond to log. And then it has a file system watcher, so if you're running locally, whenever you update stuff, it tracks it. So you have some path, and when it says, okay, is this a page? Do I need to do that? Okay, if it's server side, then I need to cache that. And the layout, I don't think I handle clients pages that don't need to do that are pages that are purely rendered on the client. That is something I intend to support, but this has been when I'm at the day job getting really angry, go work on this to be less angry.
Feel that.
There is support, so that what I showed on my laptop, where I could click on those two different links and it would dynamically reload part of the page. So that is doing the whole React server component thing. And the format for that, you're not getting HTML back, you're getting this other weird stuff. So when you just load a page the first time, or if you don't want to do any server-side React nonsense, then it's going to render to HTML, and otherwise then it's going to render to this React nonsense. And we throw .js on everything, because when it's transpiled, tack on .js, because that seems to make the source maps happy. Layout file, so they can wrap that. And then if it has this prefix, then it's a runtime file. Otherwise, oh right, this is where the actual logic happens. Okay, so if you have a user file and that user file has a directive that says this needs to be executed on the server, then it says, okay, cache that for the server so that when that happens, that there will be something for Node to execute. And then it responds with this proxy. What it returns back to the user is that proxy that I talked about. Otherwise, if it's a regular file, just do the normal thing, serve this file. Well, this is figuring out what name to hand the file system abstraction. And then I use the built-in serve a file from the file system, unless it's, well, yeah. So JavaScript, set the content, because apparently .tsx, sometimes you get some weird content headers if you just let it do its own thing. So just proactively setting the content header to make sure things actually work. And so this is the place where you could take this HTTP handler, and there's a function here that will return the HTTP handler plus the node, the private node reverse proxy thingamajigger. So you have an HTTP handler, whatever API, whatever Go API you want to stick on top of that, that's the place to do it. In your code, you call this function, you pass in a configuration, something loaded from a configuration file, and then you have an HTTP handler, and you can put whatever additional routes, you can do whatever routing you want on top of that. This is the indexer for looking up those files and figuring out how they map. I originally wanted to say, okay, let's have a glob for the URL, because it seems really straightforward. If the user sends a request to / or /blog or whatever, have in your configuration, have that as what the glob responds to, and then the value of the so the glob mapped to something, and that something says what path to look up on the file system. Which is how I had it, but then when I started doing the whole layout thing, things started to get a little bit weird. And it's ultimately, from a development perspective, if you're going to use something like the layout, then it makes more sense to have a type coupling between the location of the page file and the location of the layout than it does to have a coupling between the URL and the layout. And that was just something when I was working on it, there was some weird stuff happening, and that's just what made more sense to me. Oh, also the fact that it's a lot easier to accidentally serve something you didn't want to serve. Because if it's scanning for files that meet the specific pattern, then it's like, okay, files that meet this pattern are going to get served. Great. If it's the other way around, it's like, okay, well, can the user invent some path that when it goes through this glob matching and templating process, ends up serving something that's not supposed to be served? So that does require, if you're doing live development, it does require having a file system watcher to avoid having to reload manually, but it seemed to be the less problematic way of doing things. Template is not particularly interesting, that's just applying some templates. So, I mean, that's the Go part. I can talk a bit more about the JavaScript shenanigans, but this is not the JavaScript meetup. So, questions?
What do you consider yourself stronger in with Go, or that you appreciate more or less, or?
Oh, I love Go.
Well,
if I could do everything in Go, I would do everything.
No, I feel you, but I'm just saying of that stuff, which stuff in particular and all that, or maybe that did you try on, or new stuff that you hadn't before?
This
You
is
have at least one generic in there. I mean,
yeah. I mean the Go stuff. That's not anything new to me. That's all of the Go. The Go code in this is standard, given the work I have already done. It didn't require growing, learning, that kind of thing. The React server-side stuff is weird, and also not a well-defined API. They don't really seem to have any interest in people who are not Next.js, Webpack, TurboPack, Parcel? One of these companies who's building these systems. If you're not one of those companies, they seem to have very little interest in supporting you trying to do anything with the React server-side magic stuff. So that required a fair amount of digging through React, which is written in Flow, which is kind of like TypeScript, but not. And like trying to figure out how this stuff works. And okay, if you want to have a server component that is referencing in the JavaScript stuff, if you want to have a component, JavaScript component that is rendered on the server, and it references a JavaScript component that is rendered on the client, then you have an import statement. So you want to have two different files, and you have an import statement, and so the bundler or whatever needs to patch that and redirect it to a proxy, and that proxy needs to call the React runtime and set up a client reference, and then that client reference also has to register a thing in this global lookup table, and because it's JavaScript, and all of this bundling, transpiling crap is happening, if you do things the wrong way, then this file gets one version of the global variable, this file gets a different version of the global variable, and then your global lookup table, your global registry is no longer global. So I had to figure out bugs like that. I had to figure out how this whole client reference thing works so that when it's streaming the weird stuff back, the weird not HTML back to the browser, to the client, for the client to render it, it can actually resolve those references and load and execute the right client file, and there's no documentation for any of this. And reading through Next.js's source code is something I hope to never ever do again. It's not badly written, there's just a lot of it. And it is, there's Rust in there. Some part of the rendering process involves a Rust program that is building templates to generate JavaScript programs. Yeah, there's a lot going on in Next.js. Yeah, so that's ultimately my goal. This is 5,000 lines of code. If you remove the TypeScript's type system is not powerful enough, so I just pasted in every single HTML element so my event handler would be typed properly, there's only 4,000 lines of code. So it's a very small, relatively comprehensible system, unlike Next.js that is a gigantic monstrosity. Well, maybe not monstrosity, but not my cup of tea.
Has Vercel approached you yet with an exclusive hosting provider contract, or are you still waiting on that email?
I am very far away from trying to replicate anything like their scaling and distribution and having this part of your application running there and that part of your application running all over the place. Oh. One of the fun things about Next.js is if you have server-side code, you can have if you have two different files, because of the way they scale, and this is not very well documented, like all of the weird nitty-gritty details of Next.js, you can have one server-side file and another server-side file that are referencing the same global variable, but it's not actually the global variable anymore, because those two are running different, those two are bundled completely independently, so they have completely different copies of all of your code base. So if you do something like, hey, when the user logs in, we're going to cache their credentials in a server-side cache. Nope. Because unless all of your server-side code is in a single file, you now have two different versions of your cache. Or n different versions of your cache, where n is the number of entry points your server-side code has.
So if like React, they have like Redux or like the front end as a database or whatever. So that's still global. You still have that problem, even if you use reducers and retiers.
Well, okay, if you're client side, that's one thing. But if you're server side, so I have now.
Well, I mean, you could have that on client side being rendered from server side.
Right. The issue I ran into was specifically when you have client side code making an HTTP request to your server side code. Things that you would expect to work because presumably it's all one process, right? There are weird surprises. So if you have a Go program and you have a global variable, unless you have two completely independent processes on your computer, you're going to have a global variable. So if you have a server, if you have an API function, and if you have get the user's profile and get the user's preferences or something, and they're both referencing the same cache, the same in-memory variable, they're both referencing the same in-memory variable. Now, if you as a sysadmin realize, oh, well, for the sake of redundancy, I am deploying this application across multiple servers, and obviously those multiple servers aren't going to be sharing memory, then it's like, okay, well, sure, I have multiple processes, this is no longer a shared cache. But unless you go digging and reading the fine print, it's natural to assume that a global variable is a global variable. That shared memory locations are shared for everything within the same process. But with Next.js, you know, I have a file, and then if I have some other file, if those two files are referencing some third shared file that has a global variable, that has a singleton, and this is specifically server side, they have different copies of that singleton.
I gotcha. Yeah, it's stateless servers.
Yeah, yeah, having state in your server is a no. Or it's effectively every single entry point where you are exposing something that can be called via HTTP, you know, API, server action, or traditional API. Every entry point, every file, not every function, but every file entry point, you should assume it is a completely independent process.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing, one of the issues that Next.js, it feels like they're just like, you don't need to worry about how this works. It just works, guys. Don't look behind the curtain. There's just magic. You don't even know how magic works, but I want to understand how my code works. So that was part of the point of this. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right.
More about React's backend. I have 10 years here. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot more that we can go into with React. There's a lot of depth there, and I've learned a lot more than I ever wanted to. I thought, hey, React server side stuff, I mean, it's all over the place. It's been here for, I don't know, 5, 10 years, some amount of time, longer than I've cared about React, and surely it's relatively mature. I mean, Next.js, Vercel, like they have an entire business built around, well, among other things, React server side. Sure.
Turns out you don't need to have good technology to build a business around.
Yeah. So I assumed it was mature, and I assumed it was like, okay, well, I'm just going to define these packages, and there's going to be well-documented APIs, and I'm going to use this stuff, and I'm just going to plug into this existing. Nope. Time to go spelunking through other people's code bases.
Seems like you did nothing else. You have a really good rate on like separate the server-side JavaScript out from the client side, and then replace it with something that's not JavaScript. So that's amazing. All that.
Yeah. I mean, you could absolutely use this with zero server side. My intent was to be able to transition my day job to using not Next.js, and also to make it more useful for a broader audience. But that was the intention, to be able to support that. It would also be really fun if you could write Go code that was supposed to be client side, and the system transparently analyzed the exports of your package and created WebAssembly shim so that you could call Go on the client side. But that's a big deal. I'll figure it out.
Well, thanks for the talk. You're up next, right?
How do we connect with Apple?
Do you want AirPlay or do you want just mine?
Yeah, AirPlay.
Yeah, just
Yeah, it's already.
Antone's.
No, I don't use it. So how do you?
On the upper right screen there, and then it should be a pop-up which from the local Wi-Fi here.
Alright. How do you get on local Wi-Fi?
We're not recording, right? So the member password is right here on the screen. It's center of gravity without any spaces, and that'll get you on the right Wi-Fi for screen sharing. Otherwise, you're the wrong one.
Okay. What is the Wi-Fi?
The capital factory members.
Capital factory members.
And the center of gravity, no spaces, all lowercase. And if you try to use the guest one, it won't get you onto the right AirPlay.
Center of gravity.
And then you should see Antone pop up on the screen here. If you want to see the question around the text and make it show on the screen.
Okay, so AirPlay is top right.
Correct. Into the sharp link into the chat. Somewhere at the Google.
Screen mirror.
It's not there.
Oh, the happy yellow finder. Oh, no. I don't know.
Where'd it go?
So on my street, for 3 months, they had a cable stored in the street.
So we still have a fair bit of pizza back there. We've got, most of the pepperoni, most of the cheese, and a few slices left of the margarita and a few slices left of the pepperoni, pineapple, and jalapeno.
Because they basically.
Please drink all the booze, but I feel like carry it back, so.
Yeah, yeah. A few more beers and stuff as well, so by all means, by all means.
It's
gonna be fun when they show up, spend more time with people for the space with the custom structure.
09
It's fun, I think it's not my problem.
I can tell you right now, it has construction guys who do subcontracted.
They're the ones who do it.
This is where they've been selected, and they're like, yeah, we're moving on pretty good.
I guess I'll give a little intro about who I am. My name is Jacob Sakati.
Hi, Jake.
And I'm a Golang developer over at Golang Health. I work on payment system, and I've been developing in Golang for 3.5 years now. It's my favorite language that I've ever touched so far. I love it, and it's been like 10 years since I've been developing any type of software. So some things that I like to do is I like to write my code dry as can be, and show some examples, I guess. So we have this common DB. What this does basically is it takes any type. It has to be a database repository model, and we use generics to make any type that has this, that you can get an ID from, and that is also a proto message. And it will configure it with this base set of features that you're going to do with the fragment, basically for our database. So we set up all this stuff, and it just uses the generics. I'll talk about the pros and cons of generics and generating code. So we didn't do code generation or use any generator to generate our Go code. Instead we use generics. The thing with generics though, to get types that aren't available to you, you have to do some reflection. And I think 125 has a new update for this, a certain type, which is going to come out, which is going to change this method. But this allows you to build any type that's not exposed, which is pretty good, right? So it can deal with almost any type, even if it's exported or non-exported. So let's see what an implementation of this looks like. So here's an implementation. You create an interface, use Mockery. So if I go to the Mockery, you can see the mock here. I'm just going to, no, yeah, that's it. So here's the mock. And pretty much, you can write this same template. You just have to change the type that you're going to use, and then put in the table name. Pretty easy. And then any methods you want to export from the common DB, right? So if I go back to the common DB, you can export any of these, and they'll be functioning as expected, which is pretty nice. The one thing about this though is you have to copy this every single time. So that goes back to my reasoning of should you use generics or generated code? And I think you should use generated code, because you don't want to do this for every single type of model that you have, and that's kind of boilerplate code, and it kind of sucks. Any questions on that?
Can you talk more about that, about what specifically, because that's a lot to say, right, that you prefer generated over generics, at least to me anyway. I'm just curious to hear more about that.
Well,
Well, generated code, I can tell it to go to the, this, namespace, or not namespace, package, payment, or core, or whatever, and take that model. In fact, take for every single model in there that has the XID, interface, or method, the XID method, I want you to, generate one of these,
Okay.
structures, so that we can get access to the database instantly for that,
That's
that
okay.
model, right? And so it would create a file for every single model representing. In addition to that though, I guess one of the benefits of this is if you have, unique methods, you don't have to create another file for your utils or, your extension, your package extension. It's like these are specific to this model, which is our, called the payer funding group, right? And it extends the payer funding group database, but it's only unique to the payer funding group database. It's not unique to our common DB, which is of the type T, which is any interface of, that common, database model, right? These are acting as, just repos, right? That's the state. But yeah, I would prefer generated code because then all my models, have a repo and I don't have to create them or use that boilerplate. Or I could just go into, create a macro and have most of the skeleton, but, so that's still more work for me. Any other questions?
Yeah, for the reflecting code you had before, you said that works for pulling out like private types and unexported. Does it work even if they're in like a different package too?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome, okay.
Yeah, it does.
Usually stuff like, forking somewhere in a third party thing where I need to like go into its innards and mess around for what I'm doing at the moment. And then having like a million different vendor patch directories in the meantime. It'd be much easier just to go like dig around the unexported stuff and solve whatever I'm trying to do.
Yeah, yeah, so it's a cool way to create unexported, models. But there's also the, what is it? The link direct,
Link name?
link name, yeah. If you need to export functions or, I think so many functions, not types. I may be incorrect there.
Like you'll hit like a global reference from anywhere in the package tree, as long as you know it's that link name, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to kill that off, allow list only in 26.
And for the runtime, link name was gonna be restricted.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Are your model types always pointers? So it doesn't like.
Depends on the case, but I use pointers, I pass pointers around all the time. And
Yeah, I guess.
because it restruct, nanoseconds, I guess. It restructures it's a copy. That's something else too. So in Go, it will copy it. So if you make a mutation in a function that's taking not a pointer, but a, actual, what is it? I forgot the name now.
Value.
Yeah, it's a pass by value, right? Then once it returns, whatever you pass to that function, that structure won't contain a mutated value. Yeah.
I was asking because this function, it looks like you're expecting T to always be a pointer type, and there may be a way to constrain T to be a pointer. There are some limitations on what you can do, but
It has to be a pointer because it's an interface?
there are ways to say, I want to have a type parameter that is constrained. So you end up having to have two type parameters. You end up having to pass in as a type parameter both the value type and the pointer type. And it is possible to say, I want a value type like the struct type and a pointer type such that, or you have A and B such that B is a pointer to A and B also satisfies this interface, such that it will guarantee that you have this type A, so you could create a value of A and then a pointer to it and then cast that to B. So basically, if you can guarantee that T is always a pointer type, then there is potentially a way to define your type parameters and the constraints on those such that you can implement the generate T function without needing reflection.
If it's not an interface.
Yeah, I guess T would have to be concrete type. T would have to be a struct type.
I think so. Yeah,
I think-
concrete.
Well, yeah.
So yeah, it can't be
I mean, this.
defined to an interface.
Well, in this case, if T is defined as an interface, if T is an interface type, I don't think your reflection code is gonna work.
So it is an
Okay, constrained too, but if the concrete value that is passed in for the parameter of T is a struct pointer. So your constraint can be an interface like this. But what I'm talking about will work as long as the instantiated type that is passed into that parameter is itself a struct pointer. So whenever you have database repository, square bracket, something, if that something is a type, is a struct type, then you can construct your constraints to avoid needing reflection, probably.
If you pass it. No?
Let me try to come up with an example here,
Okay.
but, you know, I'll show you if I can get it to work.
Any other questions? I can show another example of something else interesting with the sync library. Okay. See if I remember.
Speaking of sync, just one thing that all tries to create is like, I intentionally want a copy of sync mutex, like a struct that has a built-in mutex, and I actually do want to copy it. And there's no way to tell go back to fire off and just not complain about it. There's no limit to say, I actually do need to make a copy of this mutex. When you're copying a struct that has embedded sync up mutex,
Yeah.
there's no way to turn off the alert that I can find. So I have to basically do a copy function, copies every single field.
Why would you want? You want to copy the
I literally want to clone the entire struct with a new lock on that new struct.
Oh. Okay.
Many good reasons for that, and I cannot find a way to turn off the stupid alert, so I have to probably.
Is that a control
So-
in the
There's no go that, like,
language?
Golang CI
Yeah.
is, you can override it with Golang CI, you can't override it with GoVet itself.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
we have a lot.
I would think one way you could approach something like that would be to have a nested structure, so that you have the content structure, and then you have on the outside of that the mutex structure. And so then you could have a copy of the content structure that's inside without having to duplicate the wrapping mutex structure. And so then you would say something like, this is a, you know, this is I'm just gonna make a guess here, like, this is an ARP entry. And so it's like, you got like, you know, some data that might be useful. But then you say, but I want a lockable ARP entry sometimes. But sometimes I want to have a different copy of that ARP entry, but it will be a different lock somewhere else in a different process or a different thread or whatever. But it's the same content. Well, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the mutex was on the outside instead of on the inside. So if you had like the data as a structured blob inside of the outer mutex, you would still be able to even get direct access to all the items if you did an embedding of it. So you could say that a lockable mutex is a mutex that also has this extra field. And so then you would be able to copy it like directly.
I had it usually working with someone else's giant code base.
Yes, yeah, well, that's the
So, you know, the nicest way to do it is to copy every field but the mutex. I guess the other way, kind of like inverse what you're saying is you put the mutex into a pointer wrapped substruct, and then you just make a copy of the pointer, then you just replace the pointer afterwards.
Well, in this case, it wouldn't even necessarily be the pointer. It could be the same way that we do that that we do like address specification inside of C when you're doing networking stuff. So you've got that extra header that lives off to the front of your entire C structure. So you can
just grab it.
Yeah, so you just wipe out the front copy of it. So you can get a duplicate of the whole thing. In this case, Go will complain that you've got a duplicate of the top level, but it wouldn't actually care if you were doing like a mem copy or something like that. That mutex would be bad, so you wouldn't be able to use it. But if you then like blew it away by like declaring it a new one, then that wouldn't be a problem.
Sorry, it wasn't on top.
My other code is in another PR. This isn't the finished code. So
have to go and fish that out, but, yeah. That's all I have to talk about.
Cool.
So how do you bang your team from adding like 15 tag deep nested iterator functions?
Tab?
A coworker who's lovely, but he likes to create these these iterators that are like 15 nested func call syncs, and so it ends up being functional like programming with its own. And it's
Something
really
I'm
hard to
doing,
do.
man, is I wanna get around code review. I need better code reviewers. I need to have discipline and a good set of skills and habits. And, right now, we have we enforce one reviewer per PR. It used to be 2, but our team size has gone down by like 60%. And, we're gonna do that for probably until 2 more weeks. We're gonna have a review of how that process is. What I wanna do is I want 2 reviewers, and, I want random, assignments. Purely random assignments. Because I'm a better reviewer than like most, and I want them to have my skill set, right? So I think that would be the best thing to do, because when I was on that's how I developed my code review skills, is with other people that are more expectant of you as an individual, right? So once you learn the culture around the more senior developers, that's what you'll become, right?
Yeah.
I think that's how you would want to do that.
I always see a curve of like folks early in their career start writing more and more clever code. Then the older they get later on, the more simple it gets to them. Because like I need to be able to read my own code again later.
Yeah.
Before the pandemic, there was here in the Austin Go group, we had there was a startup that was a bunch of regulars here in our group running pullrequest.com. It was a great service, but it just didn't take off to the extent that it probably should have. But it looks like they I just looked them up, and I guess the hacker one must have done an acqui-hire or something. Glad to hear it, but yeah, so that was.
So who hired them, or who actually hired them?
Hacker one.
Hacker. Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah. But yeah, so
Yeah, I think they used to be a sponsor here for this meetup, right?
I know, right? They used, pullrequest.com used to be a pretty regular sponsor before the pandemic. It was a really interesting service where basically it was like you would outsource code reviews, and so you could do it as a company, and it was they had some buy-in,
really
but not
popular.
Yeah.
Right now.
Well, yeah, but
With Cloud Code and whatnot.
They were pretty serious about vetting their reviewers. It was mostly human reviewers, but I think they were using an amount of AI, but it was mostly human reviewers at the time. But they were pretty serious about vetting them, and they were really solid. But that was the thing is I think they were still working on what does it look like to have what does it look like to convince like a big enterprise that it's okay to have this third party look at all of your code all of the time, and it not be like some big name security out or programming outsourcing company like Accenture or whatever, ThoughtWorks, whatever. Without being one of those, like what would that look like? But where it, at least at the time, seemed to be taking off, were like the highly motivated individual programmers who still valued the feedback they would get in like their day job from pull requests, and especially if those people were then trying to get into a new programming language or something like that. This was like the closest thing you would have to today having like the LLMs or something, and in fact it's probably better quality because they were getting like actual feedback from real experts on a lot of stuff. Like it was.
Anyways, Builder AI is literally the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, right.
Do you have any?
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, since you mentioned it, I'd love to hear, since you're a fan, if you have any couple practices that you feel really strongly about, that are contentious or interesting.
Data schemas matter. Don't use arrays when you really just need to use a structure, or, you know,
Yeah, okay, sure.
an object, right? Don't store inactive information in arrays. That goes back to what I was just saying, like, keep it as an object, as one source of truth.
What do you mean by inactive data?
So that's something I have a problem with over, with the legacy system we work on. We have this array, and inside that array there's another array, and each one of them is like a different type. There's a primary, the primary contains metadata, but everything that's not a primary is an actual source of like information, but then those point to another thing in the array, so it's messed up. It's so messed up. And I'm just like,
Yeah, multiple layers of inconsistent caching is never a fun thing.
it just got built by, you know, someone who, you know, just begins in life.
It evolved, you know. Like,
Yeah, it evolves. Yeah, that's
yeah,
the thing.
that's
It
the
evolves.
thing. You start with some code,
And
you don't
it's
know
like-
what's happening, and then it becomes a thing.
The company doesn't want to spend it's so big now.
Yeah.
You know, like
That-
3
now
weeks to repair.
It's too dangerous to fix.
Yeah. Well, I might we gotta fix this.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the biggest thing I would say. But when I do PRs, I don't know. Look, if I see like an if statement that says if, and then it does like executes different logic than the explicit name of the function, I'm like, that's a big red flag, because it's not one single operation. What is that? The single rule of operations, or singularity?
Yeah, yeah.
So that needs to be done outside in a different method, because what you just impose is everything that's using that method, let's say 2 years from now, it gets used a lot more by other sources or other packages. Now you're exposing all those packages to the same constraint.
Yeah.
That variable now cannot equal the value that you were expecting because of that that mutation that's occurring in that function. That's like a big one, I would say. Yeah, single responsibility. Yeah, that's it. Back to my OOP days in college.
I think over time, I become more and more of a stickler for you've got to have documentation.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, documentation has saved my life like so much.
Yeah, this idea, and also the idea of like, you know, we're gonna have a script, and here's how you call it, and you've got like 12 different arguments in order to call the thing. And it's like, look, I am all about having the ability to change these things. That's when you add 12 arguments, is when you want to change. But when like 11 of the arguments are the same thing every single time, that should be the default. Like, and that is so hard to get people.
My rule is for instruct. If it's longer
Yeah.
than 4, put a struct in it, that's a params.
Okay, that's fair.
Because every single time you have to add another parameter, you have to add the same, or the nil, or whatever,
Yeah.
to all the things that are calling it. So
Yeah.
if there's 20 dependencies, there's a 20 code edits.
Yeah.
Like, that's just horrendous.
Yeah, yeah. I
Mine
mean,
was 3 on that.
Yeah.
Same reason, because there's always gonna be more parameters, there's always, like, someone's gonna sneak it in, and I'm like, dude, you don't want that.
Yeah.
I think that's another aspect of that is I've found anyways, when I get to the point where I'm having a structure passed in as an argument, that's probably the structure itself is now a new data type.
Yeah.
And so the functions happen off of that. Instead of it being passed around, functions can be passed on to that. And so something like, you know, if the same bundle of arguments going to a bunch of places. Now it's like, you know, what do they call it? Nounizing the verb, as we do in English. We take a verb and now we've turned it into a noun. It's like, you know, it's oh, you know, we want to run this function with all of these arguments, and it's another similar function with all these arguments, and it's like, you know, maybe it's like it is a run of that thing, and now the run of that thing is like, that is a new data structure, and then doing whatever operations on it is a thing that goes on top of that. So like the first thing gives you the run, and then you're performing operations on it. So it would be like an instance of a class, even if not literally speaking, it's that conceptual.
You mean like a struct with a method set?
Yeah, well at that point, instead of passing a structure in as an argument to something, then that's probably assigned, it should be.
I do that all the time.
Yeah, the thing that functions.
If I have something that's gonna use like the same parameters over and over again, yeah, definitely. Cool.
Awesome, thank you. Do we have others? I think we got started a little bit earlier than normal today, but that's all right.
I have a totally random thing I can talk about.
Yeah, sure. At 6:40 before 80? At 6:40 before 80?
Let's see if Ubuntu likes this. Ubuntu doesn't like this understated button.
Okay, well, what was it, Arch before?
Gen 2.
Oh,
like custom kernel.
Yeah.
I'm sure I just forgot to driver. I just need to do something with like kernel config or something and it'll probably work. Oh, you merge HTML?
Okay, you heard HTML. Yeah, oh yeah, it switched, it switched.
Okay, is this still awful? Is it a hardware issue? Maybe it is a hardware issue. Oh wow, okay. Ubuntu also hates it. Huh? That's interesting. I didn't expect Ubuntu to hate it too.
Maybe it's a kernel driver thing.
Well, this is just normal Ubuntu.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It could be like a kernel driver issue.
Has anybody else who has used Linux had issues with this?
I have not, but I'm using an X220, so.
Different laptop?
I think that X220, yeah.
Very old. So, let's see what happens if I try to put this over there. It's like, maybe it will be readable. Where's my mouse? There's my mouse. Okay, well you get the big version of it. So, I have a framework, this laptop, I wanted my laptop to be encrypted. I like controlling what's happening on my devices. So I decided it would be a good idea to have my own initram or init script and initram FS and do all of that completely from scratch. And so obviously, if I'm not going to be using any of the normal tools for booting Linux, well, how am I going to decrypt my unencrypted drive? And I've got some stuff working. I'm like, well, it just shows up with this text prompt. I want a nice, pretty prompt. Also, go, because go. So I decided to write a tool that can display, they can render to the display very early boot before basically anything other than the kernel exists. And it can do the unlock of a Luke's volume. You can type in keys and all of the rendering and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so this is my project. I haven't looked at this code in forever. I just remembered it today. But ultimately, this is a Linux unlock script. So this is something you run in initram FS, or in that environment, in that pre-boot environment to unlock the device. You pass it the device name, you have some flags, frame buffer, FP0, that kind of stuff, different styles for the graphical pretty screen, that kind of thing. At least on this device, and this is partially because the keyboard is a USB device, so I can yoink parts of my laptop out. Everything, well, this is actually I2C, but this is USB, which means it goes through all of a USB device plugged in through ports and that kind of stuff, as opposed to regular laptop interfaces are normally I2C or something. I mean, the touchpad is I2C, but the keyboards are normally some other thing that happens a lot earlier in the boot process. Well, keyboard takes about a second to show up. So it's really fun when you're typing, and you just have to keep on typing and wait until the keyboard actually shows up. So fortunately...
Does it buffer it? Does it buffer like when you're typing?
No, it just doesn't register, like the device doesn't exist. The kernel doesn't know that this device is a thing, the drivers haven't been loaded. I mean, imagine that you tried to boot with a kernel that didn't have a USB driver.
Right.
That is the stage in the process where this is happening. So fortunately, UDEV is a thing. And one of my college friend also has this same laptop, and so he figured out how to set something up. So that's why there's the KB name here. He figured out how to set up a UDEV drive, a UDEV listener that is listening for UDEV events. So that is, I think it's UDEV events, something like that. So that as soon as the keyboard appears in the device tree, like as soon as the kernel's like, oh, you have a keyboard, there's a little visual indicator that pops up that's like, you can type now. And the mouse, if you plug in a USB mouse, it will work. You can mouse around with the cursor. The touchpad sometimes works. That was fun, figuring out how to interact, and this is super early boot, so there's none of the normal interfaces for interacting with the mouse system, none of the Linux services, it's just the kernel. And whatever else the init script has set up. So the keyboard part was a little bit interesting. This is just some basic stuff. Do the thing, panic, execute, blah, blah, blah. Oh, TTY stuff, yeah. To set up the frame buffer for graphical mode. The actual run function. I want to be able to test this when I'm booted, so that I can, test without having to reboot my entire computer. Also, if you're in the really early boot process, and you do something like Control-C at the wrong time, the kernel goes, process 1 is gone, panic. Really annoying to test. So there's some stuff for testing, making things work. Boolean for, is the keyboard missing? Have a go routine for, do we have a keyboard? Okay, launch a go routine to detect the keyboard. Have a channel for mouse events, process those mouse events so we can keep track of that. Okay, so this is some debugging thing. Oh, right. Because when you're booted and when you're trying to debug, you have something like the regular mouse stuff, GPM or something else like that. And you have to tell GPM, hey, no, I'm doing weird low-level stuff. Please stop messing with me.
You running it from the bootloader, or like I kind of missed like where it's running?
So you have the bootloader. The bootloader loads the kernel. The kernel has a archive. That archive is loaded into RAM as a file system. So your initial RAM FS. That init RAM FS has a /init script. That /init script is responsible for bootstrapping.
Oh, so you're running from the init script.
Yeah. So this is called by the init script. So if it's Ubuntu or something, that bootstrapping is scan your hardware, load all the kernel modules that are responsible. Mount the root device and then look through the list of modules that are in the root device, look through your hardware, find everything, that kind of stuff. I'm running Gen 2 with custom compiled kernel, so I can omit a lot of that logic because I know what hardware is on my device. But this is really, really early. So
like before the kernel module load, or around that time?
I am baking stuff into my kernel. So there's a lot of the drivers that are baked into the kernel. Any driver that is not baked into the kernel, such as the AMD GPU driver, will throw a fit if you bake it into the kernel. And the touchpad does screwy stuff if you bake it in. And other things like, I have support for Wireshark. I'm not using that every day. I don't want that to be loaded constantly. Any of those are not loaded because those are on the root file system, which is encrypted. So I have to decrypt that file system before I have access to anything that's not baked into the kernel. Open the frame buffer so we can write graphics to it, build a compositor, draw some pretty stuff on it, set up layers. Oh, okay, right. So this is a compositor, so you can build images in different layers. So I don't have to redraw the entire screen because this kind of drawing is pretty darn slow. There's no acceleration. This is pure CPU drawing. using just entirely user space, drawing routines, writing to a frame buffer device. Rewriting the entire screen every frame, not really a good idea.
Oh, so you cannot use end curses, right? It
Nope.
doesn't work, right?
I could bake end curses into it, maybe, but end curses might require other user space stuff and or other services to exist.
Right.
There's a new announcement this week that Fine folks were able to get a preview graphics repertoire.
That's fine. So, yeah, this probably could be smarter, but this was just I want the thing. I'm gonna do as much effort as I have to get the thing working. This was not trying to make it, this is not something that I'm trying to sell to anybody. So we've got the compositing, we have to, keep track of where the cursor is if we want that. Draw stuff, draw the password, draw the keyboard indicator. I think at this point we must have already drawn the base image. Yeah, so add layer, draw the base image that's behind everything else. And then, we have a loop here, and that loop, we're going to keep track of when we last draw the cursor. We're going to keep track of, we're going to have a timer to only draw the cursor so often because the mouse events can come a lot faster, and if you try to re-render it on every single mouse event, it can lag a lot with this really slow rendering. So, got the select loop selecting from various different things. Keyboard, if we decide the keyboard has showed up now, we can tell the user, hey, it's safe to type things in. Mouse, debounce, don't want to hit that too often. Do some math. Oh, these are just random constants that made it feel like the cursor was moving correctly. If you click, then we want to register that you clicked. Stuff like that. What is this? Input. Oh, this is if you're typing. So if you're typing stuff in, okay, well we have some strings, so we're going to range over all the runes that came in from the you typed stuff event, and then do stuff and try to unlock if you hit enter. So if there's a return character, then we're going to unlock with the current password, that kind of stuff. Restore the TTY so you can actually see the messages scrolling past, and you don't have this weird garbled insanity of half-rendered graphics stuff. Delete, control, yeah, so just manually all of the text editing stuff. Yeah. Nothing fancy, gotta do everything yourself. And then draw stuff, so we're in a loop, we did some things, we probably need to redraw some stuff depending on if anything happens. Set up TTY, all of it, this is, if you've never messed with changing the terminal mode, this is always fun. Reading through the Linux kernel documentation about what do these different things do? What is echo? What is canon? What is isig? I have dealt with them enough that I could vaguely remember them, but never enough to get it stuck in my head properly. I don't remember what this part
Wait, so why did you have to do all of that again?
I wanted to.
Okay.
So I was looking at Dracut and all of the other tools that construct a init RAMFS environment for you. And I want something very simple. I want something that has very little logic to it. Like my init RAMFS is mount proc sys, there's one other one, dev. Yeah,
doesn't already do all of that? Like, why did you need to
kernel doesn't do any of that.
Why does it not do any of that?
So kernel?
Wait, so the whole reason that you started doing that was because you wanted to encrypt the laptop, encrypt the storage, or?
Because I wanted to control the boot process. Because I didn't want to have some magic tool generating some magic script that's doing some incantations. I want to understand the actual process of what it requires to go from nothing but a kernel to an actual functioning system.
Why don't you just use OpenBSD for that?
What's the difference? What's the status of the point?
Because it supports encryption, and the source code is very easy to read, so you can actually understand what it actually is doing. Because it's way easier to understand than Linux.
There's not that much going on in the init script. It's, you just have to mount sysfs, devsf,
Right.
sys, dev, and proc, and then mount root, and then call swap root, something like that. So you have root, you have dev mounted at /dev, etc. and then you mount root at /mnt or something like that, and then you have to do this switch root command that says, well, I have this root fs, but actually I want to switch over to this other root fs, and then you just execute systemd, openrc, whatever your regular system init is, and it takes over.
It's just a standard CH root stuff, it's
Yeah.
just that it's happening during the switch from the init RD or whatever into the actual root file system of the running system.
So if I didn't want to do anything, if I wanted to have an absolute bare bones init script, you've got like 5 lines.
Yeah.
Mount root, boot.
Yeah.
But I want to be able to do unlock, so I need crypt setup. I want to be able to have a recovery shell. If everything goes wrong, I get dropped into a shell, so I have busybox. I want my own custom fancy screen without using these other tools that add a whole bunch of stuff that I don't know, I don't know. Like Dracut, there's just tons of stuff. You end up with a initramfs image that's, 0.5 MB or something, and it has all of this other code and these scripts that are hundreds of lines long, and
But so all of it just works like an OpenBSD, like the BSD.RD, it's like it's supplied with every release, so you can just like put it if anything goes wrong.
I mean, it just works in Linux as well. Like the point was he was playing around with it.
it's an interesting challenge. Can I
Why work
do it?
on your
How can I
car?
do it?
You can take
Yeah.
it to a mechanic.
Yeah.
I mean, I could have just left.
No, but you can literally hack it as well. Like sometimes, like you just like when you try for BSD, you just have to like use it. Like
Yeah,
it's just like those things are really easier. Like, you don't have to-
It's very much the same thing depending on which Linux distro you're talking about. Like Slackware, there's not much going on there. So, but when you're dealing with a full Debian or Ubuntu system, more to the point, or something like that, well, then there's a heck of a lot more going on. Because they're doing all kinds of stuff to convenience for later in the process, like UDEV and all that kind of crap.
I mean, just because I could. I got it working with just the regular crypt setup. I boot, there's a text prompt, I type in my password. I'm like,
you open source it?
yeah, it's on GitLab. It's just there. I mean, there's not a lot to it. There's an unlock script, and this unlock script just does your typical
What was your username? Can you?
fire lizard. I will open it in stack. Yeah, with 2 L's or 2 Z's. It's mispronounced from when I was in middle school, and that's what my username is.
You gotta say like a monster truck voice.
Yeah, I could post it in Slack. But yeah, the unlock, there's some loot stuff going on. Unseal the drive. The loot stuff is a little bit weird. Like the drive stuff, there's some shenanigans if you want it to show up in Linux, and Linux to not be like, there's just magically a thing here, I don't know what to do with it, but it works okay. There's some extra work you have to do to make that work. There's like unseal, and then you have to set up the device mapper and various other bits and pieces. Which, yeah, I was curious. There's this process. Can I do this entire thing in Go? Can I make all of this happen in Go the way I want it to happen? Turns out, yes. Make nod, symlink, that kind of stuff to make it. I mean, you can just do the unlock mount boot, but if you don't do make nod or something like that, and the various other device mapper stuff, then when you boot, systemd is like, I don't know how your root device exists. Sorry. And things are a little bit strange. They work, but they're a little bit strange. So there's a little bit of extra work calling mount without having to shell out to the mount script, because this is an itramfs, so you don't have any system libraries. So if you have a binary, and that binary has a dynamic link to some library, you have to also package that binary into your itramfs. So Go is nice because it's entirely static, but that means I need to rely on Unix.mount. And Unix.mount does not have features such as detecting the file system of your drive. So you have to have a parameter. You just have to tell it, like an old school mount, what file system is this? Oh, another thing, the AMD GPU drivers. So this has a dedicated GPU. There's an iGPU, but there's also, it's a little bit fat here because that is a dedicated GPU. And I want to run games in Windows in a VM. I don't want to have native Windows because I'm tired of dual booting and kind of hate Windows. So I want to use my dedicated GPU, PCI pass-through in a VM, but when I'm not doing games, I want it to not consume a lot of power, so I need the Linux drivers. If you take the Linux AMD GPU drivers and detach those, it works, and then you can attach the VM to it, and then you try to shut down, and it gets weird.
Yeah.
Like hung boots, kernel panics, all kinds of fun stuff. So the boot script has the boot screen has a little thing where I can either hit some key sequence or click on the button if the mouse is working, where it will say, I'm going to play games, attach the PCI stub driver so that the AMD GPU drivers don't attach to the GPU, so I can use it in the VM without it going anywhere.
Speaking of that one, I think I figured out the problem with your 640 to 480.
Yeah?
It has to do with that particular graphics card on the phone.
Oh, there you go.
I tried to plug it into the GPU directly.
So its presence is the presence of that card in the kernel confuses the EDID resolution stuff, and so you have to hijack it. Yeah.
That's
So if
interesting.
I wasn't really satisfied with any of the answers I was seeing people talk about for how to solve this, but I think like the instructions I can give you that would get you on the right path, I think,
Well,
is if you run a find command inside of sys for the EDID file that shows up when you get this, and pair that with the message output that happens from the event of adding that HTTP bind, it has to do with how this system reports its the format of the EDID information, how it gets reported to the kernel is what's throwing it off.
Huh.
It's not your laptop, it's not the thing, it's the combination of what that system is telling your laptop with that graphics card. That's what's
Interesting. Well, any other questions? I'll post this on Slack, so if you want to dig through the code, there's not a whole lot of it. Cool. Okay. Oh.
You said you had a representation of what you were talking about for reflection?
Yeah, I'm going to show that to you separately because this looks terrible. Well, I guess I can actually try to see if does anybody else want to do a talk before I stand up here and mess around with HDMI?
I just want to say we got our codes here in the back for parking. So if you parked here like I did, I would strongly recommend you grab one of those because it will save you a fair bit of money. Yeah, next month I think you'll be out, right? Ishi.
Oh yeah, not for Death on Black Eyes.
Yeah. So I'll be here. The month after that, I will be out, but Ishi will be here.
Like, get stuck with whatever pizza I like this time.
Alright, there you go. And if there is anybody who has interest in giving a talk, either a short one or a full, hour and a half long one, let us know. We've done lots of, we've helped a lot of people over the years in multiple user groups kind of get used to their first talk. And so if you need assistance, let us know. If you don't, that's cool. We're happy to have you come and give a talk. There's also been some conversation about the possibility of doing another like hackathon, bug fixathon, whatever night. We did one of those before a couple of years ago, and it went pretty well. So we could do that again. We are slowly coming up on. I know it's July, but it's time that we have to at least mention the December situation. We're probably not going to have a room in December, just guessing that this far out. So maybe we'll go to Rublos again. That seemed to go over pretty well last year. We just met for a social thing in December at Rublos, but it's just around the corner. That's where we get all of the pizza and stuff. Yeah, on 36th. But they've got this really nice. Well, it's I wouldn't call it clean, but it is very interesting. I mean, it's fairly. There's this 3-story atrium thing that you can't tell is there from the outside of the building. it's a very interesting space.
It was pretty nice. It's like bigger on the inside than on the outside.
Yeah. When you walk in the front door, it looks like a hole in the wall, and then you just keep going past that through this hallway, and then you open it up, and it's this like outdoor area that's enclosed, and it's 3 stories tall, and it's an interesting space. And we pretty much had it to ourselves for the most part. I think there were like a few people trying to eat on the first floor. We kind of took over the second floor. Well, we can do that again if people are cool with that idea. They've in the event, it is Austin, so it may not come up, but in the event that it is cold outside, they have got more than enough heaters in that place on the second floor, so it could be snowing and we'd be fine. So yeah, and it's covered and everything. So.
Was it actually open to the outside? I thought it was
It
kind
is.
of from the inside.
No, it's open to the outside. If you're in the middle area where you first walk in, you can see the sky. But it is covered, especially over on the second floor where we were hanging out. So, but yeah,
It was very nice.
yeah, oh yeah. I mean, even if it's raining, it wouldn't be a problem to be in this space because it's got a large covered area and everything. So, yeah, if there are particular areas of talks that people would like to hear more about, that's another possibility. If there's some topic you want to hear more about, we know a bunch of people. We might be able to reach out and get a guest speaker in a very specific area of interest. So.
Also, if you're interested in something more interactive, like either pairing up, hackathons, something like that, some contests. If there's another kind of Go hackathon going, you like to jump in. Like every year, I like to jump in the Epic Engine one, the kind of video game one, just because it's all Go and you can play around with cool examples. So if there's things like that, I think it would be fun to do as a group. Definitely bring them up. We obviously want to get at least more than a couple people excited about it before you make that the purpose of the meeting. But it doesn't have to be people yammering. You can definitely be interactive and something else too.
Cool. Anything else?
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming out. There's a little bit more pizza. I think we mostly got through the drinks, but there's maybe a few more back there. We'll have to be, we want to get out of here like by 8:50 or so, and because we have a hard out by 9, including like all the everything put away and everything.
As it's cool.
I appreciate what you're sharing.
Modern things that are constantly challenging us.
All of this stuff that's all my projects.
Now they used to be
Go
very.
runtime.
Also, I did know one time.
Already front end, so all the stuff you're talking about.
You don't know either? No,
Mine is kind of.
No, I have another shirt.
Yeah. Impressive expertise on all those stuff you're sharing.
Back in person,
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking about visualization, all the kinds of different stuff.
Might say on the back. Because I think it says the
That's why I'm in the space, because I'm I'm totally vacant on web stuff.
See you next
month.
Somebody could reach that, right? Oh, this parking lot. Alright, no, like, but like, there was a place I made it unplayed the wrong way. It was a to a blatant thing that it's
Yeah, move all the instability out of the test of your project.
wherever you are, it's like, somebody else doing
No, I mean, it's not about, it's about just about how
Oh, yeah,
That requires a level of
and, you know, I have
we hired a good here. And then there's a gap, and then we have people thinking 360 scale, we're just gonna keep running it, we're like, oh, we need to ship that like first quarter, and it's at the end of it, it requires all the free. Stuff like that, it's like, no, they were hoping we did that, because they didn't talk to people.
That's just the system of my age, I gotta have too much trash.
No, I mean, I'm
Like a wall and like a
no, I'm the same way,
That's how I ran out of space. And by the way, yeah, I got, well, I have a full collection of these things now. And this is a gun show around the road. And it's like the only time when I saw something that was somewhat decent, such trash.
I got this one at a, this is like basically a woman, it's basically a woman, like what's your name? Drew.
I get very right.
What's your, how are you? How dare you? Yeah, you wanna go for it, how good for it?
It was always coming into a relatively mature project. But then really quickly within that framework, you basically call everything. And then like, find an existing piece of code that and I was doing this for a very long time, and I actually have my video. And so like, oh yeah, actually, in reality, that's completely But basically,
So that we're not.
yeah, it's
Somebody should write it.
not about the one we were talking about. Okay, I got it.
Somebody asked.
But that means you know about like structure. I wanna say like variable.
Yeah, well, just that kind of stuff, so I was sharing with H2 that, he was sharing about the little games and visuals and things like that. So I get to do that, I do that stuff, except I'm doing it with 3D, high-performance graphics with the Go back end. So it's really fun and you know. So yeah, I like to say, any developer.
Like, what actually, because I honestly don't understand how graphics works, but I thought it was the Go program,
So
then it would like,
I mean, if I could say strong.
like essentially not necessarily mark the frame buffer, but like have some kind of API that will use kernel, and then, like, so this doesn't sound like a backend, but it could be like the actual program or just.
Well, it's not, it's different, so again.
That's not the terminology you're using.
No, yeah, so, well, this project is rather unusual. It's actually a real back end, but what you're going to turn up on is the Unity client. So all there's like the Go runtime can be embedded, or you can use it for years.
Is what I know.
But the idea is that, so here's the background. In the 3D environment, so you can feel like real, those 3D developers, they live in a different world, but like most of them don't go near anything else, so like their support for doing stuff sucks. So being able to, so this project is around, I can actually go back to yeah, no,
I don't understand right now, but
I did like CC++ for like 10 years, and I would have quit software, thanks again, bro. I would have quit software if it wasn't for Go.
Thank you.
Well,
If you want me to send you some information on that, I'll take your email or something.
Oh, yeah.
So, anyway, that's my stuff. So, if you're using a normal distro, then that normal
This is a very
distro,
long email.
I know.
How did you have such a long email?
that normal distro will set up the.
You should see how long his email is. His is impressive.
I've never seen an email that long.
The email address?
Yeah, his email address is impressive.
It's way short.
It's like 4 characters.
4 characters?
Yeah, like it's 5. Yeah, activation that higher.
Yeah.
It could be more than that, I don't want to type myself.
What is it?
I will email you a link or something to more of the explanation.
Oh, why did my character
shorter?
Yeah, no, he's like, I haven't really played this game that much, I just want to know, like, all the features.
So they were talking about how in your career you start writing more complicated code and then you get experience and start writing less complicated code.
Yeah.
The level of complication that I teach at is really insane. Like, I'm writing a .NET application and I decide that handwriting a bunch of pages to display contents of database tables is annoying. So I'm going to use a thing to do reflection, but the reflection is really slow. So instead, I'm going to write something to dynamically emit C# machine code, or the VM machine code. And so you have that, there's a function that reflects on the data type of the object, and then assembles, like, there's code that is just emitting assembly instructions that will build a function, and that function is the page that will emit the HTML for data.
We've got 4 slices of cheese and 1 slice of pepperoni.
Be the hero.
I have lots of experience of using generics.
You want?
I don't know.
We can
There's
get
no
rid of pepperoni
go
if
edit
you
experience
want.
immediately
No,
was like,
I'm not taking it.
It's probably a little too oily.
Yeah.
I went with olive oil instead of tomato
it's
this
like
time. I
the-
think next
the-
time go
oh,
back to
it's
the
not-
traditional tomato is
I
probably.
thought it was
Yeah.
good if there was like.
Tomato versus olive oil.
No, I just want to take a picture.
Because in some ways, Java generics don't really exist. Java generics are compiler are basically like TypeScript. They're annotations where the compiler will say that this thing is
Going, can't stay here. This
You guys
is
finished?
actually.
I got one.
Okay.
I have parts of the church.
What do you do with the rest of them?
Bring
I
back.
can put them up there and he can open the other.
They're dated, so you can't really use them for more than a day anyways.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's pretty.
I've heard that like people were using them for like the whole day or whatever.
They only good for a couple hours.
No, they're expired like in October.
Yeah.
So they're dated for like a few months.
That's good. Alright, get out.
I think
Let's go,
someone-
Mia, go.
Oh, you want to take it?
Oh, I mean, I was just bringing everything. I was just
Okay.
gonna bring this license.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna do.
Awesome, we're out in the woods. Anything else for me?
Oh, you guys not taking it?
No, go for it, yeah.
Take a different.
We need to leave the light on
Oh, okay.
so that the,
Cleaners?
clear snow.
Okay, cool. I think we got everything else from the six straight out here.
Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah.
I wanted. Do you know if one of those is not like very oily? I wanted to.
They're all empty, I think, besides that. They should all be empty. It's all empty boxes.
No, no.
Yeah, but he was talking about doing
Oh, the
swaps.
Yeah, I wanted to swap.
Oh, box work. Oh, wow, you're right, anyway.
Yeah, I definitely noticed it was much more than normal.
Never gets too dark, use LED lighter candles.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Alright, sorry about that, thank you.
There's one pizza slice left. There's one pizza slice left. See? Thank you. Pero, huh? Yeah, there's one slice left if you want. Yeah. Yeah, one slice. Yeah, go on.
muchacho que saca la basura, de las cajas de pizza de Domino's, habían 30 cajas así.
I need to get one thing. We need to get one more of these.
Just take a couple, why do you just take one?
Well, that's alright, same reason I don't need overpass. Same reason I don't need overpass.
Sorry about that.
Digo que estos parecen pollos para comer. Dejan un reguero. No te ha tocado cuando hay eventos, porque aquí 2 veces al año tienen unos eventos grandísimos. Ay, sí. No, estos pisos quedan horribles, horribles. Siempre para ese día nos vamos como a las 12 de la noche. Sí, porque ahorita sabes que hay uno en marzo y en octubre. Ahorita fue de octubre. A ver cuánta gente viene. El año pasado creo que fueron como 10,000 personas. Y fueron poquitos. Dijeron que habían sido muy poquitos. Ay, Dios santo. Y en la tarde, empiezan a llegar como a las 5 de la tarde. Sí, suben la caja al 8, están en el 1. Pero para ese tiempo aquí sí, el piso 8 y aquí tenemos prohibido entrar. Entramos hasta como a las 10, se empieza a revisar a 9:30. Si ya no hay gente en el piso, ya se desocupó, ya nosotros entramos a la tierra. Pero si siempre empiezan a estar bien. Hay gente, traen gente, también lo que para que saquen según para que no dejen tan sucio. Según para que no dejen tan sucio. La última vez que yo vine y ya no quise por lo mismo, me dejaron en el piso 5. Ahí pues me dejaron a mí solita. No. Empecé a hacer, o sea, pues se ponen hasta 3 botes de café. Pues, no, el café no duraba ni 5 minutos. Lo bueno que allí hay 2 cafeteras, a veces ni había terminado una cafetera cuando la que acababa de poner ya no tenía. Estaba, trae y lleva. Bastante café. Pero De calzón. Oh, sí. Yo igual que las casas donde yo hice de 10, ay, Dios mío. Que amar, pues. No, y súper espeso. Y no sé si en aquí se parte ya te tocó lavar unas tacitas chiquitas. Ah, sí. Que es la mitad de acento del café.
Blanquitas, chiquitas.
Sí, desde la mitad.
Uy.
O sea que se toman la mitad del concentrado de café.
Ajá.
Porque eso no es café, eso ya es concentrado de café.
Trago es. Yo un café amargo lo siento que me cuesta tragar.
Uy, no, a mí me dan ganas de vomitar.
Sí, nosotros tomamos muy suave. Pero de hecho a mí me gustaba mucho también el café hervido. Apenas 2 años y ya me hervido.
Es oro.
No, se me olvidó, veas. Ay, es un blanco que es de hervir.
¿No es el café oro?
No.
¿El Nescafé?
Coscafé creo que se llama.
¿O el Coscafé?
No, el Nescafé ese. Lo vi en para, yo lo he visto para.
Pero también hay uno que se herve, ¿no?
El Nescafé.
Bueno, no sé, porque
No, yo he
los...
visto solamente de hervir. Ajá, ese oro y el
Sí, porque mi abuela, ella, nosotros en la casa tomábamos nada más café oro. Porque a ella no le gustaban los demás. Y a mí el café listo, a mí no me gusta.
¿No le gusta?
No.
Es bien raro.
O sea, es que sabe raro.
Sí. Bueno, yo ayer tomaba Nescafé o café listo de todo.
No, yo el café listo, eso sí no me gusta.
Y aquí el que tomo de hervir, perdón, sí, de hervir, es el Nescafé. Sí, porque el cafecito no hay. Y el de hervir sí es perdón, el pollo. Es como...
Sí. No, yo aquí en la casa, como...
Uy, ahí están las cajas de pizza.
Sí.
Voy a limpiar la ventana, la puerta.